Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Fantasy for the Ages, the show where father and son sit down and talk about fantasy, science fiction, and any other nerdy stuff we feel like talking about. Today is a Just Jim episode as I bring to you one of our to read or not to reads. A great opportunity for you to learn about a book series that we're familiar with that you might want to read or might not. This is a spoiler light episode, so I'll talk about some generalities of what I'm going to cover today, but I will not ruin the plot. If you haven't read this is a perfect episode for you. And if you have read it, great to watch and see if you agree or not, and you can rant back at me with your thoughts. If you'd like to do that, put it down in the show notes, respond to me in the comments here, or hit us up on Discord or any of the places in social media where you can find Fantasy for the Ages. Speaking of, down below this video, we hope you'll like this episode, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to our channel. We love seeing more people following along with the fun that we're trying to have here on Fantasy for the Ages. My apologies if I'm a little rusty here today. I've been out on vacation for 2 weeks, and this is my first time back recording. I think I remember how this works, but if there's glitches, well, like I said, a little bit of rust. But I'll get rid of that by the end of the day. In order to keep up with our episode schedule, I'm recording 3 times today. This is my last day of vacation, so what did I decide to do with it? Wash clothes, drink something, of course, and podcasting, content creating all these new videos and audio recordings for you. I've got a bunch to do, and I'm glad to bring it all out for you today. This one, if you've caught by my background here, a to read to not to read, is going to focus on the Deathgate cycle. Some fascinating fantasy books. But, oh man, again, rust. I gotta tell you what I'm drinking. I haven't mentioned this yet. So what am I drinking? I've got a nice white wine here. Vacation, I was on a cruise, unlimited drink package. You can drink a lot there, so I'm going easy now. I've got to kind of get back on my keel, and this is just a nice white table wine, Farmhands White from Pomeroy Cellars, local boutique winery here in Washington that I've mentioned on the podcast before. And I got to remember to sip from time to time since I'm the only one talking today. As we move into this to read or not to read, again, spoiler light, I'm not going to ruin things for you, but this is a highly subjective episode. I'm going to share my opinion of the book, and usually Zach and I do these together, but he hasn't read these yet. So this is all me coming at you. You could totally disagree with my opinion. If you've already read it, you'll know that. Or when you choose to read them, if you do, you can say, wow, Jim, you were whack. I hate this stuff. Or, this is way better than you said. All such opinions are valid. I'm just going to give you what I think. This is not literary analysis. This is fanning. Okay, I'm just kind of telling you what I think. But I will give some legit reasons for the claims that I make about this series. So let's get just the facts on the Deathgate cycle. These are 7 novels that were written collaboratively by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. Now, if you recognize those names, they were broadly acclaimed in the fantasy genre through the Dragonlance Chronicles. Margaret Weis was already an established author. Tracy Hickman got into this with her, and they put out the first trilogy of Dragonlance and then did some more Dragonlance and really popular books. And I love Dragonlance. That's been out there for a while. These are something completely different. They have nothing to do with Dragonlance. The first book was published in 1990, and the final of 7 in 1994. So these were pushed out relatively quickly compared to what we see from modern fantasy authors. And while they're no Brandon Sanderson Stormlight Archive length, they still average around 450 pages in paperback, so they're not tiny. These are decent length fantasy books, and there's a lot in them. The fact they came out fast does not diminish the quality of the writing, of the the plot that is created. And Weiss and Hickman really got to work here making a decent series. Well constructed. They did write the Dragonlance Chronicles first, as I've mentioned, and that was under contract with TSR, and later to become Wizards of the Coast. So the things they wrote in Dragonlance, they could not use in writing something brand new. This is a completely separate venture, branching out on their own, but tapping into this big fan base they'd created through writing Dragonlance. So they've got that success and they get to ride its coattails into something totally new. Of course, people were going to try this. And in general, the Deathgate cycle was a commercial success. And still, if you go and look it up on Goodreads or other various rating places, they generally rate around 4 out of 5 stars. Pretty decent. And the ratings do progressively improve as you work your way through the 7 books. The crux of the story is that the authors have created a post-apocalyptic story that doesn't at first appear that way. And it has surface level stories in the first 4 novels of the series that are set on top of a deeper background underneath story, which stretches through all 7 books. That series, that long, slowly developing story, is revealed bit by bit as we move through the books. Some of the common fantasy staples of the 80s and 90s are on display here. Humans interacting with other well-known races, elves, dwarves, dragons, and then other more unusual creations, some made just specifically for this series. There are magic systems, a couple different kinds here, and they're unique. This is something they created specifically for the Deathgate cycle. But magic, okay? We see that in fantasy. The general civil settings and structures are reminiscent of medieval Europe. Again, another common fantasy trope. You got your kings and queens, merchants and taverns, and a relatively low level of technology on display, for the most part. The 7th book does soundly complete the series. There's never a reason for there to be a sequel. The story is ended. There are really no loose ends left. So that's the facts of the Deathgate cycle. Now let's talk about opinions. First off, my personal experience with this series, and boy, I need a sip. I read this on the strong recommendation of our Patreon supporter and friend, Jordo. I read these over the latter half of 2022, and I finished up right at the beginning of 2023. So they sat on my TBR for well over a year, but finally fit them into the reading schedule. As I read and tweeted about my experience, I found there are many huge fans of this series. But in general, when they reference how much they love the Deathgate cycle, they're talking about when they read them back in the 90s. Long time ago. These are not people who are currently into the Deathgate cycle. Now that's, humorous for me because I was reading fantasy in the 90s. I'd never heard of these. They just never somehow caught my attention, which is doubly humorous because I read Dragonlance. I knew Weiss and Hickman. I loved their stuff. Somehow never caught the Deathgate cycle. Now reading the Deathgate cycle, I have to admit I struggled with this series, particularly the first 3 books. I didn't find them sufficiently engaging for my preference in fantasy fiction. I did feel the books improved in holding my interest later on, particularly through books 5, 6, and 7. But I still had to push myself a little to keep going. There were other things I wanted to read that I was more interested in. However, having completed all 7 books, I do not regret reading them. So let me talk to you about some of the whys and wherefores behind how I feel about reading this series. In To Read or Not to Reads, I break this up into strengths and then weaknesses. So let's just talk about the good stuff first. The strengths I see in the Deathgate cycle. First of all, the authors have created unique worlds for this series, which are built upon different elements. So we've got a world founded on air, another on water, another on fire, and another on land or stone. Sort of. It's more like plant life. And then the fire one has a lot to do with stone. Okay, so this stuff gets a little muddy in here, but these four worlds are very unique, very different. And this impacts directly the novel that's focused on the worlds, because these first four novels in the series, each one is specializing on one of those planets. There are other worlds. It's not necessarily the best word to use, but there are other worlds involved in the story, including Earth. But you'll have to read the series to understand how these things all tie together. That's a little too spoilery for me to dig into, but I wanted to highlight as a strength these four specific worlds that are unique and are major players in the elements of the Deathgate cycle. Another strength. While the humans, elves, and dwarves all pretty much match what we expect from these traditional races in fantasy fiction, there are also a couple of other races introduced, the Sartans and the Patrons. And these two races, while quite human-like, are definitely not human. They have magical abilities that are fresh and new compared to what I've read elsewhere. So a nice twist and addition to the fantasy universe. Now, speaking about that magic, the magic systems of these two races are somewhat related, and Weis and Hickman have considerably developed and fleshed out the, for lack of a better word, the science behind the magic systems. That's somewhat of a strength, and it's laid out in the back of each of the books, trying to teach you how this all works and how it's all tied together. Another strength is the conclusion of the series. It's a very positive payoff, which honestly I felt was well needed by the time I got to it. All the things that are laid out over the course of the 7 books all come together with a big finish. There are no loose ends left unaddressed, and the conclusion makes sense. Not that you can see everything coming, but nothing is glaring or jarring as, what the heck? Where'd that come from? No, it's all logical. It's a good conclusion. 2 more strengths I'll throw in, and these are character-driven. Dog. Dog is a strength. I can't explain more without spoiling, but you meet Dog pretty early on, right in the first book, and he's one of the best aspects of the entire series. So if you read it, you'll know what I mean, and if you already read it, you know what I mean, absolutely, and you better be a fan of Dog. The other character that's a strength is Zifnab. Okay, this was a really unique one, and when I came across Zifnab, who's introduced in book 2, I was like, that's hilarious, being a Weis Hickman fan. Zifnab, Zifnab, is a, what's the word when you just move the letters around? Anagram, that's the word. It's an anagram for another character that they created in Dragonlance called Fizban. Both of them, both these characters, are like magical wizards. That's who you meet. That's what they look like. They're both quirky in the way they talk. Zifnab is obviously borrowing the character from Dragonlance that they created and liked and porting him over to this new series. But TSR owned all the intellectual property of the Dragonlance Chronicles, so they could not use Fizban. And yet I think they maybe talked back doors with TSR or something. They said, we want to have some fun here. We think the fans will love it. We don't think it'll hurt Dragonlance. It'll just actually kind of entertain the fans and keep them fully engaged. So we're going to take Fizban and we're going to put him in here, sort of. It won't be exactly the same, but there will be a lot of parallels. and we're going to change his name by just reversing some letters. So Zifnab is a character you meet and has various roles throughout the rest of the series. Uh, Very entertaining. And I will note Weiss and Hickman do this again in something else they've written. You can Google it and see what you can find. Now we get to weaknesses. There are some weaknesses, in my opinion, of this series. First of them is pacing. The first 4 books are laying out a lot of world building and a lot of plot pieces. They're going to have later payoffs, but sheesh, it's plotting to get all that out. Now, I reflected on why do I feel this way? Because a lot of the people who loved these books back in the day don't feel that way. And I was having a different experience. And I think what it is that I found, I sense there's this underarching plot. It's certainly by book 2 that I start to realize is going on here. Something, a bigger story that's going on that is not moving forward very quickly. And it's underneath the story in each of these first 4 novels. Now, those stories are just happening and are taking place, but I didn't find them grabbing me. That they weren't as, I don't know, vital and necessary. If I was just reading those stories by themselves, forget an underlying backstory, maybe I would have found them more interesting because I would have paid attention just to what was going on in that novel. But that's not what happened as I worked through the series. I'm reading the story and going, this doesn't seem that super important. There's something else going on that I want to know more about, and it keeps spending time with this stupid, silly stuff. I think that was what was going on in my head. So I was frustrated that the series didn't move along fast enough to give me the really critical, more important things that I should be knowing about. By the time to get to book 7, I felt maybe I had been a little too harsh in my opinions of books 1, 2, and 3, and those plots that are just for those novels. But that doesn't invalidate how I felt as I read those books. So I would say there is some pacing issues in the way the overall story is created. A second weakness. That magic system that I already talked about is kind of cool and unique, created just for this series, I'd say is also overly complex. Honestly, it seems rather impractical insofar as how the magic is implemented, particularly by the Sartans. And while I appreciate all the detail the authors put into developing the ins and outs of this magic and explaining the background of how it all works, it seemed almost a writing exercise rather than being entirely necessary for enjoying the story. So maybe they tried to make this harder magic than it needed to be. When I picture the way the Sartan magic is laid out to be used, I don't know how they actually do it. It's like, how? No. In the middle of the experiences they're having, how do you actually make that magic happen? That's not going to happen. That's not going to work. Okay, so overly complex and impractical. That's how I felt about the magic system. Finally, the last general weakness I'll put out here is that I found there was self-destructive and delusional behavior being demonstrated by many of the significant characters of the series, and that those characters therefore were too artificial and caricature-like, and diminished how much I appreciated the books. You look at some characters, you can go, fake. That's not how anybody would be. That's that's totally implausible. It takes you out of the story. So those are my weaknesses. Tell me if you agree, if you've read these, especially if you've read them more recently than back in the 90s. If you think I'm way off, maybe you need to go reread them again, and you might feel exactly as I did. Would I ever read the series again? That's a question we always come to for to read or not to read. And in this case, I can safely say no. I honestly regret that I didn't learn of this series back in the 90s and read it in that point in my life and with the context of what I knew about fantasy that far, I may have enjoyed it much more prior to encountering so much more of the high quality fantasy fiction that's come out since then. So I think this book suffers from what's come since. It doesn't hold up. It's still a fun tale. There's still good stuff to enjoy in it. But again, I think I might have been one of these fans going, oh yeah, Deathgate Cycle, this was great. One of my favorite books back in the day, if I'd read it back in the day. I didn't have that benefit. Therefore, we get to the rating scale part of this episode, where we always take the book series we're talking about and put it on a 1 to 100 scale of how we subjectively feel this series rates in comparison to all the rest of fantasy fiction we've read. So this is not saying how it compares to all fantasy fiction that's out there, just based on what I've read. Where would I put this? I struggled with this a little bit. I sometimes feel I'm a little harsh on the Deathgate Cycle, so I didn't want to go too low. I really tried to think about the merits of the individual elements of the story, the overarching tale throughout the 7 books, not just how I felt frustrated at times with pacing and such. So I've given it a 25, meaning I'm saying there's about 24% that is not as positive and good for me as the Deathgate Cycle. Don't ask me which ones, because it's hard to think of them. But I'm sure there's some out there. Just this is not an all-time favorite for me. My last question that I'm going to answer for you then is, what sort of person do I think might enjoy this series? Definitely someone who's newer to the fantasy genre. This might be a nice introductory or gateway series into fantasy. It's got a lot of basic elements there, but it's not too deep, not too hard. Simple enough to consume, and there's nothing really in it that's going to offend you or push your thoughts. It's definitely not progressive or modern, as we see. There's no grimdark involved. There's not really any representation. It's very traditional classical fantasy. So, if you're just new to this genre and you just want to try something that's pretty basic, this might be a good series to start with. And then you can move on. If you liked it, you can move on to things that are a little more challenging, a little more modern. Also, if you're just someone who doesn't like a lot of where modern fantasy has gone and likes the traditional, more classic form of fantasy fiction, this fits in that pocket. So you could enjoy it. If you liked The Lord of the Rings, The Chronicles of Narnia, some of the older classics of fantasy, this could work for you. All right, that's what I have for you today. With just me talking, this turns out to be a bit of a shorter episode than it usually is, because Zach's not filling any of the gaps, and I'm forgetting to stop to take sips of my beverage. But that is where I'll leave you today. Let me run our outro to remind you of the places you can find us, because we love to hear from people, and even just your thoughts on this particular episode, come and tell me. One of the way you give thoughts on the episode is, again, liking the episode and subscribe to the channel. Join us on Discord. An invitation is in the show notes. You can support us on Patreon. We do have a Patreon site, and help us keep on going with all the content we're bringing you. There's all the things you can find for social media and how to find us, even an email, because I'm a little old school. You still have them. That's where I'll leave you then. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.